What happens when a Vietnam veteran haunted by decades of guilt and unanswered questions comes face to face with a man whose life he unknowingly transformed? As buried memories of the battlefield resurface, a single conversation holds the power to redefine their past and inspire their future. Will this reunion bring the closure they both seek, or reveal truths neither is ready to face? Don't miss this extraordinary story of courage, connection, and redemption. The rhythmic creak of Roy Bennett's rocking chair filled the small living room as he sat by the window, staring out at nothing in particular. The television hummed in the background, a documentary about the Vietnam War playing on low volume. Roy wasn't watching it. He rarely could. The sound of helicopters, explosions, and men shouting in the chaos stirred feelings he'd spent decades trying to bury. The house was modest, reflecting the life of a man who preferred simplicity. Framed photos of his younger self in uniform hung on the walls, their faded colors capturing moments of pride and purpose. In one, he stood with his unit, all youthful smiles and camaraderie. In another, he clutched a medal, his expression a mix of humility and discomfort. Roy didn't need the photos to remember those days. The memories were always with him, whether he liked it or not. A knock on the door broke his trance. Slowly, Roy stood, his joints protesting the movement. As he opened the door, he found his neighbor, Hank, holding a package. "Morning, Roy. This was left on my porch by mistake," Hank said, handing over the small cardboard box. Roy nodded in thanks, offering a faint smile. "Appreciate it, Hank. You doing all right? Haven't seen you out much," Hank said, his tone casual but concerned. Roy shrugged. Same old, same old." Hank lingered for a moment before nodding. "Well, let me know if you need anything." With a polite goodbye, Roy closed the door and set the package on the kitchen counter. He didn't remember ordering anything, but his name was clearly on the label. Carefully, he sliced the tape with a pocket knife. Inside was a small, ornate wooden box. Roy hesitated before opening it, his fingers tracing its smooth edges. Lifting the lid, he found a letter folded neatly atop an object wrapped in cloth. Unfolding the letter, he began to read. The handwriting was elegant, almost formal, and the words made his chest tighten. "Dear Mr. Bennett, my name is Sam Porter. I believe you saved my life during the war." Roy stopped, his hand trembling slightly. He stared at the letter, the words blurring as memories flooded back. He hadn't heard that name in decades. Who was this man? And why, now, after all these years? Roy stared at the letter for a long moment, his breath shallow and uneven. The name Sam Porter danced in his mind, stirring something faint and distant. A moment buried deep under years of silence. Setting the letter down, he pulled out the object wrapped in cloth. As he unfolded it, his heart skipped a beat. It was a military patch, frayed at the edges, but unmistakable. His old unit's insignia stared back at him, its colors faded but still recognizable. He traced his thumb over the threads, memories trickling in like drops of water breaking through a dam. The patch felt like a relic from another life, one he had tried not to revisit, for fear of drowning in what he couldn't change. The rest of the letter lay open on the counter, daring him to continue. With a deep sigh, Roy picked it up again and forced himself to read on. "I was just a young private back then, barely 19, when you pulled me out of the jungle during that ambush. I've spent 50 years trying to piece together what happened that day and what drove you to risk your life for mine. I'd like to thank you in person if you're willing. Please, consider this my invitation." The letter ended with a phone number and a request to call. Roy lowered it, his fingers gripping the paper tightly. The words had brought back a vivid image. Dense jungle foliage, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and a panicked young soldier crying out for help. He could almost hear the shouting, the rapid fire of bullets, and the crushing weight of a man draped over his shoulders as he ran. Shaking his head, Roy folded the letter and set it down. This was a part of his life he had locked away long ago. But why now? Why had this man, after all these years, decided to reach out? He found himself pacing the kitchen, the quiet of the house amplifying his inner turmoil. His eyes flicked to the phone mounted on the wall. He could call and put this to rest, or he could ignore it and let the past stay buried where it belonged. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the porch. Turning, he saw his friend Frank peering through the screen door, his weathered face full of curiosity. "You all right in there, Roy?" Frank called. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Roy hesitated before opening the door. "Not a ghost, Frank," he said quietly, holding up the letter. "Just something I never thought I'd have to deal with again." Frank leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, studying Roy with a sharp eye. "Well, are you going to tell me what's got you all rattled, or am I supposed to guess?" Roy sighed and stepped aside, motioning for Frank to come in. He grabbed the letter from the counter and handed it over without a word. Frank unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read. The silence between them stretched as Roy paced the room, his boots thudding softly against the hardwood floor. When Frank finished, he let out a low whistle. "Sam Porter, huh? You saved this guy's life in Nam?" "Apparently," Roy muttered. He rubbed the back of his neck and leaned against the counter. "I don't even remember his name. It was chaos out there. I wasn't thinking about names or faces, just getting people out of that hellhole alive." Frank nodded, his weathered hand tapping the letter. "Still, it sounds like what you did stuck with him. He wouldn't have written this if it didn't mean something." Roy let out a bitter laugh. "You think he's looking for closure? What about me, Frank? I've spent 50 years trying to close that door, and now he's asking me to open it again." Frank shrugged, his expression calm but knowing. "Maybe that's exactly why you should meet him. You've been carrying this weight alone for too long." Roy shot him a look, but Frank didn't flinch. It was the kind of unspoken honesty only someone who'd seen the same battles could offer. The two men had been friends for decades, their bond forged by shared experiences and the understanding that some wounds never fully healed. "What if it just stirs up more than I can handle?" Roy asked, his voice quieter now. Frank chuckled softly and patted him on the shoulder. "Roy, if there's one thing I know about you, it's that you can handle a hell of a lot more than you think. Besides, what's the worst that can happen? You meet the guy, have a talk, and if it's too much, you walk away." Roy mulled over Frank's words, his eyes drifting back to the patch on the counter. It felt like a sign, one he wasn't ready to face but couldn't ignore. He didn't respond, and Frank, sensing he needed time, grabbed his hat and headed for the door. "Think about it," Frank said, pausing on the porch. "Sometimes looking back is the only way to move forward." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Roy alone with his thoughts. He glanced at the phone again, the weight of the decision settling heavily on his chest. Could he really confront the ghosts of his past? Or would he let this chance slip away? The house grew unbearably quiet after Frank left. Roy found himself staring at the letter again, the handwriting neatly curling across the page. It was almost too neat, too deliberate, as if Sam Porter had spent hours perfecting each word. Roy folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, but its weight didn't leave him. Instead, it lingered in the air, thick and heavy. The old clock on the wall chimed once, breaking the silence. Roy turned toward the kitchen, his stomach growling faintly. He pulled open the refrigerator, but the sight of leftovers didn't spark any interest. Instead, he grabbed a beer and sank into his recliner, the bottle sweating in his grip. The war had a way of creeping up on you when you least expected it. For years, Roy had kept those memories locked away. He'd built walls, hardened himself against the guilt and sorrow that had followed him home. And now, with just a few sentences on a piece of paper, those walls felt like they were crumbling. As the night deepened, Roy couldn't stop the flood of images rushing through his mind. He saw the jungle, the endless green that could swallow you whole. He heard the crack of gunfire, the shouts of men scrambling for cover. And he felt the crushing weight of a wounded soldier slung over his shoulder, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. There was something else, too, something he had tried not to remember. The faces of the men he hadn't been able to save. They haunted him in his dreams, their eyes staring back at him, full of questions he couldn't answer. Roy rubbed his temples, trying to push the memories away, but they wouldn't leave. His mind drifted back to that day in the jungle. He could almost hear the voice of a young soldier crying out, "Help me!" The desperation, the fear, it was all too vivid. His hand tightened around the beer bottle. He didn't even realize he'd finished it until the glass clinked against the table. Roy leaned back and closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. "Way now," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. "Why, after all this time?" But no answer came. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. Roy glanced at the phone again. The thought of dialing the number on the letter made his stomach churn, but ignoring it felt just as impossible. After what felt like an eternity, he stood and walked over to the window. The moonlight spilled into the room, casting faint shadows on the floor. Roy stared out at the quiet street, the envelope still clutched in his hand. "Guess I don't have much of a choice, do I?" he whispered. The decision wasn't final, but it was a step. He set the letter on the counter and turned off the lights, letting the darkness swallow the room. Roy awoke the next morning to the first rays of sunlight creeping through the blinds, the letter still sitting on the counter where he had left it. The envelope seemed to glare at him, daring him to pick it up again. For a man who had always been decisive under pressure, Roy found himself paralyzed by the weight of such a simple act, dialing a phone number. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the steam curling from the mug. His routine had always been his anchor, something that kept the ghosts of the past at bay. But today even the ritual of morning coffee couldn't distract him. The war had left its mark on him in ways he rarely spoke about. His hands, steady now, still remembered the feel of a rifle. His ears, accustomed to the quiet of his small town, could still pick out the distant echo of artillery fire when his mind wandered. And his heart still bore the scars of the faces he couldn't forget. The sound of a car door closing snapped him out of his thoughts. He glanced through the window and saw the mailman walking up the driveway. Roy opened the door before the man could knock. "Morning, Mr. Bennett," the mailman said with a friendly nod. "Anything exciting today?" Roy shook his head, offering a polite smile. "Just the usual, I'm sure." After collecting the mail and thanking the man, Roy returned to the kitchen. He flipped through the envelopes, bills, advertisements, a magazine he barely read anymore, until his gaze fell back on Sam Porter's letter. It sat there, stark and intrusive among the mundane clutter of daily life. Before he could second-guess himself, Roy reached for the phone. His fingers hesitated over the buttons as he memorized the number in the letter. The thought of hearing Sam's voice felt strange, almost surreal, but he couldn't avoid it any longer. With a deep breath, he dialed. The phone rang once, then twice, and Roy's pulse quickened. On the third ring, a voice answered, a warm, steady tone that carried an unmistakable air of gratitude. "Hello, this is Sam Porter." Roy cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of what to say. "This is Roy Bennett," he began, his voice steady but measured. "I got your letter." There was a pause on the other end, but it wasn't awkward. It felt like Sam was taking a moment to absorb the significance of this call. "I'm glad you called, Mr. Bennett," Sam finally said, his voice filled with genuine relief. "I've been waiting a long time for this." Roy sat down, gripping the phone tightly. The weight of decades of silence felt like it was lifting, ever so slightly. "So have I," he admitted quietly, not knowing what else to say. And with that, the conversation began. A bridge between past and present, built on words Roy never thought he'd have the courage to speak. The drive to meet Sam Porter was both familiar and foreign to Roy. The road stretched long and straight through the plains, flanked by fields and scattered clusters of trees. Yet, despite the familiar sights, the journey felt surreal. It wasn't just the destination, Sam Porter. It was the unspoken confrontation with a part of himself he'd left behind decades ago. The miles rolled on, and with each passing hour, Roy's thoughts turned inward. He hadn't spoken much to Sam on the phone. The man had simply thanked him for calling and given him directions to his home in a small town several states away. Sam's voice had been calm but eager, and it had left Roy wondering what kind of man Sam had grown into. Was he like so many other veterans Roy had met, carrying the weight of war in quiet solitude, or had he somehow moved on, free of the invisible chains Roy himself still bore? The hum of the engine filled the cab of Roy's old truck. On the passenger seat sat a small box. Inside it, the same military patch Sam had sent, along with a photo of Roy's unit, taken during a rare moment of levity in Vietnam. He'd dug it out the night before, thinking it might be a good way to break the ice, though now he wasn't so sure. The photo was a snapshot of another life, a world that felt distant, yet unshakable. As the highway gave way to smaller, tree-lined roads, Roy caught himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. He tried to focus on the present, the crunch of the tires on asphalt, the faint smell of the fields. But his mind kept drifting back to that day in the jungle. The shouts, the gunfire, the adrenaline. The moment he had seen a young soldier, Sam, though Roy hadn't known his name, lying motionless in the mud. He'd almost left him behind. The thought still made his chest tighten. Pulling into a quiet neighborhood, Roy finally saw the address Sam had given him. The house was modest, a neat single story with a small garden out front. An American flag hung from the porch, swaying gently in the breeze. Roy parked the truck and sat there for a moment, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. He saw the front door open and a man stepped out. Even from the truck, Roy could see the years on Sam's face, the lines, the gray hair. But there was a warmth in his smile that instantly put Roy at ease. Sam raised a hand in greeting, and Roy forced himself to take a deep breath. "This is it," he muttered to himself. As he opened the door and stepped out, Sam walked toward him, extending his hand. "You must be Roy," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth Roy had heard on the phone. Roy nodded, gripping Sam's hand firmly. "Yeah, and you must be Sam." For a moment the two men stood there, taking in each other's presence. Roy realized he'd been afraid this would feel awkward, but it didn't. It felt... "Come on inside," Sam said, motioning toward the house. "We've got a lot to talk about." Roy followed, his steps steady but cautious. He wasn't sure what he would find in Sam's story, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to listen. The living room was cozy, filled with soft light filtering through the curtains. Shelves lined the walls, adorned with books, family photos, and small mementos that told stories of a full life. A faint scent of brewed coffee lingered in the air as Sam motioned for Roy to take a seat on the couch. "Make yourself comfortable," Sam said, his smile genuine, but tinged with a nervous energy. "Coffee? Tea?" "Coffee sounds good," Roy replied, easing himself into the couch. His body felt tense, as if it didn't belong in a space this warm and inviting. Sam disappeared into the kitchen, and Roy let his eyes wander. Among the photographs on the mantel, one in particular caught his attention. It was an old black-and-white snapshot of a young soldier, Sam unmistakably, though his face was leaner and his eyes less burdened. He wore a grin that Roy recognized as the kind only a young man at war could muster, a mixture of bravado and innocence that time eventually erased. Moments later, Sam returned, carrying 2 mugs of steaming coffee. He handed one to Roy and settled into the armchair across from him. For a while neither man spoke, the silence filled only by the faint clinking of ceramic as they sipped their drinks. "I've thought about this moment for a long time," Sam said finally, his voice steady but soft. "I wasn't sure I'd ever get the chance to thank you." Roy shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "You don't have to thank me, Sam. I was just doing my job." Sam's expression grew thoughtful. "Maybe that's how you see it, but for me it was everything. You saved my life, Roy. I don't know if I ever told you, but I didn't think I was going to make it out of that jungle." Roy leaned forward, setting his mug on the table. "It was a tough day for all of us. I remember the ambush, the chaos. To be honest, I didn't even know your name back then. I just knew you needed help." Sam nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I was barely 19, fresh out of training and scared out of my mind. When I got hit, I thought that was it. But then I saw you, this figure dragging me out of the mud while everything around us was falling apart." Roy didn't know what to say. Hearing it from Sam's perspective brought a clarity he hadn't expected, but it also reopened wounds he'd tried to keep closed. "I carried a lot of guilt after that day," Roy admitted quietly. "There were others I couldn't save." Sam looked up, his eyes filled with empathy. "I know that weight, Roy. We all carry it in some way. But what you did for me, what you risked, it mattered. It still matters." The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt less heavy. For the first time, Roy sensed that this meeting wasn't just about Sam thanking him. It was about both of them finding a piece of the closure they'd been searching for. "I've got something to show you," Sam said, rising from his chair. He disappeared down the hall, leaving Roy alone with his thoughts. The quiet was broken only by the ticking of a nearby clock, marking the slow passage of time. Roy leaned back, gripping his mug tightly, his mind replaying the moment he'd pulled Sam from the jungle. When Sam returned, he held a framed photograph in his hands. "I'll explain in a second," he said, setting it down on the coffee table. "But first, tell me, what do you see?" Roy leaned in, studying the photo. His heart skipped a beat. It was a group of men standing outside a building with a large sign that read Bennett Veterans Outreach Center. His name, bold and undeniable, stared back at him. Roy stared at the photograph, his eyes fixed on the sign that bore his name. He didn't know how to react. Pride, disbelief, and confusion all swirled together, leaving him momentarily speechless. He glanced up at Sam, who was watching him with a mixture of nervousness and quiet satisfaction. What is this?" Roy finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam sat down across from him, his hands clasped together. "It's what I've been working on for the last 20 years, he said. "The Bennett Veterans Outreach Center. It's a place for guys like us, veterans who've been through hell and need someone to help them find their way back." Roy blinked, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "Why my name? Why not yours? You're the one who built it." Sam shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Because you're the reason it exists. If you hadn't pulled me out of that jungle, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have had the chance to build anything." Roy leaned back in his chair, the weight of Sam's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had spent so many years trying to forget the war, to push away the memories of what he'd done and what he hadn't been able to do. And now, here was this man telling him that his actions, his survival, had created something good, something meaningful. "I don't know what to say," Roy admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Sam replied gently. "Just know that your sacrifices meant something. They still mean something." Roy nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the photo. He could see the faces of the men standing in front of the building, each one carrying their own story, their own scars. For the first time in years, he felt a small flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, his service hadn't been in vain. Do you think I could visit the center?" Roy asked hesitantly, unsure if he was ready to confront what lay ahead. "I was hoping you'd say that," Sam said, his smile widening. "I'd love to show you what we've built, and I think the guys there would love to meet you." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of the conversation hanging in the air. For Roy, it felt like a door had opened, a way to step out of the shadows of his past and into a future where his actions could still make a difference. As they stood and prepared to leave, Sam patted Roy on the back. "You did more than you'll ever know, Roy. Now it's time for you to see it for yourself." Roy nodded, a quiet determination settling over him. He didn't know what he would find at the outreach center, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. The drive to the Bennett Veterans Outreach Center was quiet, the hum of the road filling the space between the two men. Roy sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his knees as he glanced out the window. The small town gave way to open fields and winding roads, each turn bringing him closer to a place he hadn't known existed until a few hours ago. Sam drove with a calm focus, occasionally glancing at Roy, but letting the silence linger. "You okay over there?" Sam asked finally, breaking the quiet. Roy nodded, though his jaw was tight. "Yeah, just trying to wrap my head around all this." Sam smiled softly. "I get it. It's a lot to take in. but I think once you see the place, it'll make sense." As they turned onto a gravel road, Roy caught sight of the building in the distance. It wasn't flashy or grand, but it had a sense of purpose. The structure was a single-story, sprawling facility with a wide front porch and a row of rocking chairs lined up neatly. A flagpole stood proudly in front, the American flag waving gently in the breeze. The sign near the entrance read, "Bennett Veterans Outreach Center" in bold letters, and Roy felt a lump rise in his throat as he read it. Sam parked the truck and turned to Roy. "You ready?" Roy took a deep breath and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." They stepped out of the truck, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots grounding Roy in the moment. A few men were gathered near the entrance, their conversations fading as they noticed the newcomers. Sam waved at them, and they waved back, their faces lighting up with recognition. As they walked toward the entrance, Sam began to explain. "We've got everything here: counseling services, job training, a community garden. A lot of the guys who come through here are just looking for a place where they feel understood." Roy listened, his eyes scanning the area. He noticed a group of men working on what looked like a small wooden bench, their hands steady and purposeful. Another man sat on the porch with a dog at his feet, the two of them seeming to share an unspoken bond. When they reached the door, Sam held it open and gestured for Roy to step inside. The air was warm, filled with the faint scent of coffee and freshly baked bread. The walls were lined with photos and artwork created by the veterans who called this place home. A few people greeted Sam warmly, their voices echoing in the open space. "This," Sam said, his voice full of pride, "is what you made possible." Roy stopped in the middle of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the people around him. He could see the hope in their eyes, the strength they'd rebuilt in this space. It was overwhelming, but in the best way possible. "I don't know what to say," Roy admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Sam replied. "Just take it in." Roy nodded, his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. For the first time, he saw the ripple effect of his actions, not just in Sam's life, but in the lives of everyone in this room. Roy stood in the center of the room, taking it all in. The quiet hum of activity around him, the soft laughter from a group in the corner, the sound of tools being used in a nearby workshop made the space feel alive, filled with purpose. Sam watched him closely, giving him the space to process everything. A younger man approached, his handshake firm but nervous. "You're Roy Bennett, right?" he asked. "The Roy Bennett?" Roy blinked, caught off guard by the weight the man placed on his name. Yeah, that's me." The man grinned, his face lighting up. "I've heard stories about you. Sam talks about you all the time, about what you did. It's an honor to meet you, sir." Roy managed a small smile, though he still wasn't used to the attention. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what I had to." "That's what makes it special," the man said earnestly before heading back to his group. Sam stepped closer, his voice low. "They look up to you, Roy. Even if they don't know you personally, your story gives them hope." Roy's chest tightened at the words, but before he could respond, another voice called out, "Sam, you going to introduce your guest or what?" A small crowd had gathered near the workshop area, their curiosity evident. Sam chuckled and motioned for Roy to follow him. As they approached, the men and women greeted Roy warmly, their smiles genuine and welcoming. Some offered handshakes, others simply nodded in respect. It was clear they knew who he was, even if Roy wasn't entirely sure how to handle it. One of the older men in the group, a grizzled veteran with a cane, stepped forward. "You're the guy who dragged this knucklehead out of the jungle, huh?" he said, pointing a thumb at Sam. Roy chuckled, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "That's one way to put it." The man laughed, clapping Roy on the shoulder. "Well, I hope you know what you did mattered to him, and to all of us here. If it weren't for Sam, I don't know where I'd be. And if it weren't for you, we wouldn't have Sam." The words hit Roy harder than he expected. He glanced at Sam, who nodded in agreement. "They're right, Roy. None of this would have been possible without you." Roy felt the weight he'd carried for decades begin to shift. For years, he'd only thought about the lives he couldn't save. But now, standing in this room, surrounded by people who had found hope because of one choice he'd made, he realized the ripple effect of his actions. "I don't know what to say," Roy admitted again, his voice thick with emotion. "Just say you'll come back," Sam said with a smile. "We could use someone like you around here." Roy looked at the faces around him, each one carrying their own story of survival and resilience. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, a connection to something bigger than himself. "I think I'd like that," Roy said quietly. "Yeah, I'd like that." As the group welcomed him with laughter and warm words, Roy felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in decades: peace. He knew the journey wasn't over. There were still memories to face, wounds that might never fully heal, but for now, he was exactly where he needed to be.